Welcome to Time Capsule, where we analyze history to find lessons worth learning. Today we're going to talk about the Great Famine, or the Potato Famine, from Ireland in the 1840s to 1850s. What was the Great Famine? The Irish potato famine was caused by a mold that rapidly spread throughout Ireland. The mold killed half of the potato crop in 1845 and up to 75% in the following years. This was particularly bad due to the dependence that the Irish people had upon the potato, and only a couple of varieties too, like a monocrop, if you will, or a single crop culture. The impact on the population was enormous. 1 million people died between 1845 and 1852, and about 2 million people left Ireland. Depending on the source that you read, it's like 1 to 2 million left and 1 million died. We're going to discuss the Irish potato famine of 1845 to 1852 because of the impact of a few years, like less than a decade, really. I think it was like 7 or 8, and then how it impacted the population of a location, particularly Ireland, for hundreds of years later. At the end of the show, I'm going to show the continued impact that this has had on modern people and some of the conclusions that we can draw from this. The ratification of the Act for Union of Great Britain and Ireland in 1800 caused Ireland to be ruled as a colony of Great Britain. Great Britain appointed the heads of state, the Lord, Lieutenant, and the Chief Secretary of Ireland. The Irish could choose their own members of Parliament, but unsurprisingly, many members were British or of British descent. Originally, any Irishman who practiced Catholicism was prohibited from owning or leasing land, voting, or holding office under the quote-unquote penal laws. The funniest thing about this is, just as I said before, only those, or I should have noted that only those with land or landowners or landholders could actually vote or be a member of parliament. So this particularly eliminated the majority of the population, the Catholics. The penal laws were repealed in 1829, but the effects were still felt during the Great Famine. The majority of the landholders who owned land were English or Anglo landholders. Most Irish Catholics were forced to work as poor tenant farmers. This isn't unsurprising. In a couple of decades, the majority of the population didn't gain to own land. Where else have we seen this? Such a lack of distribution of quote-unquote wealth. A good example of that is South Africa today. Even though apartheid may have ended decades ago, the majority of the wealth is still held by the white population, and they represent still a very small minority of the population. It hasn't been shifted to the majority of the population. In 1845, when the crop failed, people asked the Irish Queen in Parliament for assistance. I'm sorry. In 1845, when the crop failed, the people of Ireland asked the Queen Victoria in Parliament for assistance. They acted and repealed laws that imposed tariffs on grains and corn. In 1846, there was a shift toward reliance on Ireland on its own, sources due to a change in civil administration of the British government. The source of funds for supporting the British was moved to the Irish landowners, absentee landowners. The problem with this is when the Irish tenant farmers were the ones that were paying the tax revenues or the tenancy, let's say rent or what have you, they were starving to death because of crop failure. So the source of the funds that were going to be able to support them, i.e. the rents or the payments from the tenants, were just not there. Where's the money going to come from? So the Irish people and the Irish peasants were unable to pay the landowners, so they soon ran out of funds. It's not surprising. So then what happened? Logically, the tenant farmers were evicted. The crown, or the British crown, did set up workhouses for them to go work, to be able to earn some money, but many people didn't like to go. They found that the cornmeal was a poor substitute from the food that they had grown themselves. And the British did provide limited loans for assistance to soup kitchens, sorry about that, and public works, but it only lasted a short period of time, unfortunately. And many people did eat at the soup kitchens, but the funds dried up. At its height, there were 3 million people eating out of the soup kitchens. In, in I believe in 1840, say 1835 to 1845, before the start of the Great Famine, there were 8 million people. So that means 3 million people were eating there out of 8. That's a large portion of the population. Now, here's the worst part, in my personal opinion. The Irish tenant farmers were still exporting to Britain. Like the things that the Irish tenants farmers were growing on their land were still exported. The goods they produced were too expensive. They couldn't afford to buy them. Imagine your family starving and raising a cow and you cannot eat it. That's kind of sick. Now, what were the results of this? Poor governmental management of a crisis can lead to resentment by Irish populations. This increased Irish nationalism because of the poor handling done by the British. And I'm sure that this had a lot to do with the Irish independence movement, the IRA and bombings and the problems that they had with the British over the successive decades and hundreds of years. And the other thing, too, that I find so remarkable is that the demographics shift. The demographics of Ireland still feel this today. The population of Ireland dropped from 8 million in 1844 to 6 million in 1852 by the end of the famine. Now, to put this in perspective, about 1 million people, depending on the source you get, it's 1 to 2 million left Ireland to emigrate to other places, notably the United States, Canada, ironically, England, Scotland, and Australia. By the time Ireland reached its independence in 1920, it was half that in the 1840s. In 2021, the population is a little over 5 million. It still hasn't recovered. I mean, we're getting on 9 successive generations. In 9 generations, your population can't recover. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up was economic policies have more far-reaching consequences. The British government's policy of laissez-faire and free trade contributed to the severity of the famine by allowing grain exports from Ireland to continue, even as people were starving. The British government still refused to subsidize or pay for the Irish people to be able to keep their grain and cattle exports, for instance. They could have done more. And because of that poor economic policy, and I only mean this from a humanitarian perspective, it had a huge impact on the then population and even now. Thank you for your time. Have a good day.